I'm ta-nehisi Coates. I'm a senior editor at The Atlantic, and I'm honored to be the moderator of this panel. 2013 USA, Will a Divided House Come Back Together? To my immediate right is Grover Norquist, who is the president of Americans for Tax Reform, the author of Leave Us Alone, Getting the Government Hands Off Our Money, Our Guns, Our Lives. Next to Grover is Katrina Vanden Heuvel, editor and publisher of The Nation, co-editor of Taking Back America and Taking Down the Radical Right. Very interesting. Next to Katrina, as you can see, this will be very exciting. Next to Katrina is David Gargan. David is a senior political analyst for CNN, the director of the Center for Public Leadership at the JFK School of Government at Harvard University, and an advisor to 4 presidents. And I want to lead right off from that last bit on your bio, David, as advisor to 4 presidents. I want to right away sort of challenge the very basis of this panel. Will a divided house come back together? There's always this talk about political polarization, country divided, red and blue, and especially over the past 10 years. My question whenever I hear that is, what does that mean historically? Are we actually more polarized today than we've been over the course of our history? Obviously, this isn't the Civil War, so I mean, we've had points where we've been polarized, but throwing that out, how bad is it when you put it in to some sort of historical perspective?
It's bad. It's very bad. This system was meant to be contentious. The founders, especially Madison, understood that it was going to be interest set against interest. And they argued in the Federalist Papers that actually the bigger the union, the more effective that would be. You could be able to work things out. And so we've had a lot of periods of contentious politics, mean-spirited politics. But usually we've been able to resolve our differences. Usually we found ways, and compromise has not been considered a dirty word, as it is so often today. Grover has argued that on more than one occasion. And so usually people have been able to find things. There's only been one real period when we did not work it out, and that was the 1850s. And now we're not, I don't think we're in danger of going to civil war now, but we are in serious danger of national decline because we're unable to address some of the more serious issues facing us, such as the question of K-12. But there are many other issues as well. In the national debt, both Admiral Mullen, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Bob Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, both argued that the single biggest threat to our national security does not come from China, does not come from the Middle East. It comes from our debt. And if we're not able to address that, we're going to have serious issues. But the Council on Foreign Relations just issued a report. Joel Klein is going to be here in one of your panels later on. They issued a report saying the state of K-12 education in this country has now become a threat to our national security. So I think these are serious issues, and I welcome this chance to have a conversation here because we have 2 people whom I think have argued very, very authentically about what they believe. And they come from places of real conviction. And the question is, given that, can we still work things out?
So, Grover, do you think compromise is a bad word?
No, I'm in favor of compromise. We just had a debate last year about whether we'd pass the Paul Ryan plan, which reduced spending from what Obama wanted by $6 trillion, and we only got $2.5 trillion. So that was a compromise. And because we didn't get the 6, we only got 2.5. What some people urge the other team to do is to lose and call it compromise. If you're trying to go to California from New York and you're in Missouri, that's not treason. That's not betraying your principles. Missouri is on the way to California. But if your feet are wet and everyone around you is speaking French, you're not compromising, you're losing. You're heading in the wrong direction. So I'm all in favor of compromise, which is going in the right direction more slowly than you'd like to. But I think one of the reasons that this sense of heightened friction, partisanship exists is that today, as opposed to 50 or 40 years ago, the divisions in American politics also align along party lines. I mean, 40, 50 years ago, we had regional parties. If somebody told you they were Republican, all you knew about them was they were born north of the Mason-Dixon line. And there were all these little old ladies in Mississippi who agreed with Ronald Reagan on everything and voted for George McGovern because Sherman had been mean to Atlanta recently. So you had regional parties, and everything was bipartisan. The people who tell you, oh, why can't we have the good old bipartisan days, are telling you how old they are. because they remember when every fight was the liberal Republicans and the liberal Democrats on one side and the conservative Democrats and the conservative Republicans on the other side, so everything was bipartisan. But they were still fighting on principle. But during the lifetime of Reagan, two teams sort of sorted themselves out in a very, what I consider, much more rational way. If you want larger, less constrained state power, you're a Democrat. If you want more constrained, smaller government, you're a Republican. And you move into two different corners, which makes all fights on principle also arguments party conflicts. So the shirts and the skins are a little more obvious now than they were before. So I'm not sure it's more contentious, it's just clearer, and I think more useful. Voters have a better idea when they vote for an R what they're going to get, or vote for a D, they know what they're going to get. They get to choose.
Katrina, one of the things, I was just listening to Grover talk, and he makes a good point about liberal Republicans before and the divisions that we have now. But one of the things I always think about is, so you take the New Deal, you could have a segregationist Democrat in the South supporting the New Deal. That went away in the 60s. How much of this is the result of the expansion of our electorate over the 20th century? We have a really, really diverse electorate right now that we did not have in these heydays of liberal Republicans where you saw all this great bipartisanship before.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important question, but if I could just come back to this idea of, why can't we all get along? So much of the old bipartisanship was premised on an economy that worked for almost everyone. We do have the capture of a Republican Party by an extreme right wrecking crew which considers compromise capitulation. I have many issues with the Democratic Party. The last book I wrote was called The Change I Believe in, Fighting for Change in the Age of Obama. And I think that the Democratic Party has failed to come forward with a program of real economic security. So it isn't speaking as it could to a diverse electorate. I certainly don't think the Republican Party is. I mean, I think we're seeing a replay of an old Southern strategy of excluding important elements of the rising American electorate from the Republican Party. But Grover told me that he was in the men's room here and someone said, "Hey, you don't have horns." And I think Grover said, "No, they're retractable." At The Nation, we are known to be progressive, left, liberal, but we were founded as an independent publication in 1865 by abolitionists. So there is always the hope that one can find issues to work on. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about national security and foreign policy. But I do think that there is a disservice to the rising American electorate, the diverse electorate you're talking about, ta-nehisi, in key fundamental economic ways. And this idea of shared sacrifice, I find wrong-headed because so many millions of Americans didn't participate in, for example, the Wall Street Bacchanalia, which is still wreaking havoc on so much of this country.
David, you raised an important issue at the beginning. You were saying, to your mind, our biggest national security question is debt. What is the problem with with forging a bloc to deal with that problem in Washington?
Well, I think we've seen now months and months of inability to really forge a coalition that's big enough to get anything passed. It's not that there aren't some people in both parties who agree with each other, but it's not a big enough group. And looking ahead, I must tell you, I think this is going to get worse before it gets better. I see very little prospect that we're going to get some sort of harmony after this election is over. We can talk more about that. But on the deficits, I think that, let me come back to Grover's argument, because it really is rooted in that. Grover is absolutely right that parties for a long time they were more regional and they had elements on both parties. There were people in the Republican Party who were more liberal than some people in the Democratic Party and vice versa. I think that's quite true. And it was Franklin Roosevelt who actually tried to purge the Democratic Party in 1938 of its conservatives. He went around the country and in various primaries tried to knock them off because he wanted to create a liberal party. I think sometimes you ought to be careful what you wish for. It's not clear to me that this has worked out to have a conservative party versus a liberal party, because what has evolved here as we've moved in the direction of having these two parties is that the center is collapsing. And people who were willing to work across the aisle are getting eliminated. Look at Dick Lugar's problems right now. Look at what happened to Bob Bennett in Utah. They took Bob Bennett out, although he was quite conservative. Orrin Hatch is probably going to survive. But in terms of major breakthroughs on legislation, it's really, really important to understand that the milestones, when we've broken through and gotten big agreements, they have been done on a bipartisan way. Pat Moynihan taught me that some time ago. If you look at every major piece of social legislation passed all the way back to the New Deal, it was done with supermajorities in the Senate. And whether it's Social Security or Medicare or Civil Rights I or Civil Rights II or tax reform of '86, they were all done with supermajorities. Now, to get that done, you had to have people who were willing to cross the aisle and were also tended to be a little more centrist. The civil rights bills would not have been passed in '64 and '65 had it not been for a man who came from a conservative Southern position, who changed his mind over time about civil rights, starting with 1957, but then moving on to '64 and '65, and who could work across the aisle because he had a close working relationship with him, and they talked almost every day, with the Senate Majority Leader, Everett Dirksen, who was a Republican, and was pretty conservative, Grover, I think by most counts, but on this issue, he was more moderate, and the center held, and we got the civil rights bills of '64 and '65. I happen to think they were great advances for the country.
Katrina, one of the things, just really quick.
President Obama came to Washington trying to seek common ground.
Right.
Some of, the liberal left felt he gave away far too much. He would have cut a deal with John Boehner if John Boehner couldn't work people like Eric Cantor and the coalition behind him, because they weren't going to cut a deal. Now, why weren't they going to cut a deal? Some of it goes to the party structure, but much of it goes to the fact that he arrives in Washington, President Obama, and the first thing he hears is Senator DeMint saying, the health care bill will be your Waterloo, and Senator McConnell saying, we don't want you to be able to govern. It is true that the great leaps have come from the bipartisan. But one thing that's missing here, if I could, two things. One is the idea that debt is our greatest crisis, in my mind, is wrong, and it is we can talk more about it. It is an elite consensus. It doesn't track with what majorities of Americans feel should be the priority, which is putting people back to work. And movements have played an important role, in addition to Kennedy's assassination, Johnson's moving, but movements through time have pushed those inside Washington to take steps they might not otherwise have taken. And that disconnect is something we're also seeing now.
I'm going to let Grover go, and then I'll come over to you, David.
I think it's healthy that the American people
I'm sorry,
actually...
one second, Grover. I was supposed to say this at the beginning. If by chance you decide you want to exit our riveting conversation, and I know no one here will want to do that, please use the back door. That just came to you. I was supposed to say that at the beginning. Don't use the side door like somebody's doing right now. So. All right, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Other way around.
I'm sorry?
Other way around.
Other way
Which
around.
door
Use the side door.
Oh, use the side door. I had it wrong. Don't use the back. Use the side. Sorry about that. Whoever that was, I just called out. I'm sorry. My apologies. My apologies. Go ahead, Grover. Forgive me.
I think it's healthy and helpful to have the two parties actually be clear about what they're doing and where they're going, that if people vote for somebody, they actually have some sense that they're going to do what they say they're going to do. Bipartisanship, the old argument was a stupid party and evil party, and every once in a while they get together and do something in a bipartisan manner that's both stupid and evil. But I would argue when most bipartisan agreements are when you get a consensus of the establishment and of the governing class against everybody else. So they can all get together and have campaign finance laws to make it very difficult for third parties to operate and very difficult for challengers to succeed, and they can get together and in a fit of bipartisanship raise their pensions. So you can see bipartisanship take place at the state level and the federal level, where it's usually the governing class against everybody else. At least we have a fighting chance with two different political parties, with two different visions of what's good for the common good as opposed for the establishment. I would also argue that while people say, oh, there's this gridlock in DC because nobody's doing anything big, this is a new complaint from the left to center folks because, of course, for the first 2 years when Obama had supermajority in the House and a supermajority in the Senate, he did everything on a partisan basis and didn't return phone calls from the Republicans. That was not a problem. It's when he failed to be able to pass his legislative agenda that we had this terrible gridlock problem, which is all partisan as opposed to the partisan consensus when they were a majority. But that gridlock, or they're not passing something big in either direction, right or left. Take a look at the states, and I brought enough copies for everybody because I think this map explains the next 10 years. They're supposed to have handed them out, or will hand them out as you come in or out that door, not that door, that door. And what this is at the state level, we don't have gridlock. At the state level, we have a sorting out. The red states, 24 states, Republican governor, and a Republican legislature. If the R's get together, they can turn their state into Hong Kong, okay? 24 red states. There are 11 blue states. Democrats have the governorship and both houses. Illinois can turn itself, has turned itself into Greece as quickly as it wants to. And there are 11 states, California, I mean big states, California, Washington State, Illinois, Arkansas, West Virginia. And so you've got, and again, in the blue states, you can have the kind of government that the Nation argues. There was a great article in the Nation years ago by a fellow's name began with G, who argued for, we've lost the national government, what we should do is use the initiative process to turn California into a European social welfare state and govern by example. And I think that is a healthy and good idea to have states where they can, Louisiana's passed school choice for half the kids. Okay, you worry about K through 12. Does school choice work? Maybe it's a bad idea. Teachers unions don't like it. We're going to find out whether it works. And so the red states are experimenting in one direction. The blue states are experimenting in a different direction. Now, this is a rather recent map. This is from the 2010 election. But because of redistricting, the blue states have redistricted themselves pretty much to make sure that they'll be blue for the next decade. And the red states have largely redistricted themselves to make sure that at a legislative level, they'll be red for the next decade. So while governors will come and go, this division, it's not north-south, but the country is going to be trying very, very different approaches. Wisconsin has changed the rules that they had been operating under with government-run unions and their ability to collect union dues from teachers, having the government collect the dues for them. That's no longer the law of the land in Wisconsin. And people decide if that's the direction they want to go, and people can move from states that are not working to states that are working. You already over the last decade see several million people moving from high-tax states to low-tax states. I would argue that people prefer to live in the low-tax states. That's why they move there. Other people may see it differently. But again, we now actually have both sort of gridlock partisanship in D.C. until this next election, which will sort things out, which is okay. But at the state level, we actually are going to have examples. And I think that if somebody's left of center and believes that low taxes and less regulation and tort reform and school choice will destroy a state, then let's experiment on Florida and Texas and Pennsylvania. And if somebody on the right thinks that the left is doing the wrong thing, well, let's do it in a state first before we have a conversation about taking it national. So watch for this partisan divide to not give you gridlock at the state level, but actually give you a lot of motion in one direction or the other.
David, I see you over there shaking your head.
I just wanted to enter friendly amendments to a couple of the comments here. Grover is right about the states being laboratories of democracy, something that Brandeis argued years ago. That is an important concept in American federalism. And it does work in some states. In Louisiana right now, there is real change going on in the schools, and I think it's welcome change. But I would point out.
We'll find out.
We'll find out. But it's not because it's all turned red or blue. It's because Governor Jindal, who's a Republican conservative, is actually working very cooperatively with a Democratic mayor of New Orleans. And they're doing things in a very, very positive way together. It's because people who are the school reformers coming in from the KIPP schools and the Teach for Americas are actually working with the senior veteran teachers of the teachers unions. And they form a working relationship that is, I think, making real progress. I've had an opportunity to go down there, and it's just a miracle what's happening on the ground in Louisiana. And there are other states, however, which are not working laboratories right now. I was in California recently, had dinner with Jerry Brown, and he talked about what it was like to try to govern California in years past versus what it is today, it's much tougher to govern California today than it once was. And California, in many, many ways, is almost paralyzed, not working. You know, they're not working out their public finances. Their schools have deteriorated. You know, California has become more and more of a mess, as we all know. Whereas, you know, Texas, I think Grover would have a perfectly good argument that Texas has worked out as a low tax state, low regulation, and they've got high, you know, they've got low unemployment.
Strong growth
Yeah,
and people move
yeah,
there.
Yeah, but I don't think it's fair to argue that we've sort of reached nirvana where some states are going to have one kind of experiment and the other states are going to have other kind of experiments. In fact, we've got some states that are working and many states that aren't working. That the paralysis and the polarization we see in Washington is mirrored now in the states. And just one thing coming back to Katrina, it is true that John Boehner has a real problem in his caucus. And people who made it much, much more difficult to reach an agreement on the big deal that they were trying to work. But, Katrina, that argument that was come from the left, now we've had two major takeouts in the Washington Post, and especially in the New York Times, who made the argument, yes, that was part of it, but the other part of it was that Obama did move the goalposts. He did raise it. You know, he presented a Boehner with a deal that was much more difficult for anybody to accept on the Republican side. You know, so I mean, it seems to me there's a lot of fault on both sides when it comes to.
You know, see, I disagree with that because I do fundamentally believe that the Democratic Party at this moment is a centrist party, because the goalposts have shifted so fundamentally as how you define right, conservative. I think there's asymmetrical polarization, at least in Washington, where you have a party, the Democratic Party, that still believes, and I believe in this, that you need a fusion of the private marketplace of government and the civil society sector. I do believe, largely due to Grover Norquist's devilishly Machiavellian work.
Call him brilliant, that's what you wanted.
I have a hard time, but the no compromise on taxes is starving the beast. I mean, Grover Norquist has achieved, in some ways, what he wanted when he said, you want to shrink government, take it into the bathroom and drown it. Who would have thought we'd be looking at a Paul Ryan House GOP budget heading out into 2050 that would cut all discretionary spending, except for the military, Social Security, Medicare? Is that the kind of country where you want to invest in the future of a country? You both talked about education. This crowd, I suspect, would seek an America that is competitive. We are gutting our educational system. You talked about California. We're ground zero on tax madness with Prop 13, et cetera. You now have one of the great state university systems which is being starved of resources. And I think that fundamentally is an overlay as we look out on the future of this country. There's the fairness inequality frame, not to use a sterile word, is what is at the root of how people are looking at this country. I think we'd agree in some measure that there are enormous problems with government, and that government will be an extraordinarily large issue in this campaign. I thought Mitt Romney was channeling Jack London when he spoke about the oppressive boot of government ramming down people's throats. But many, where I sit, see a government that is rigged against the interests of average people, that has been taken over by big money. So it's not necessarily big government, though I like the idea of effective government more, but it's the takeover of big money. And there needs to be a countervailing force, to use the expression the economist John Kenneth Galbraith coined. And we're going to lack that if we deregulate, privatize, and go the route I think Grover has artfully put into the, quote, mainstreamized in many ways. Your point of view that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, would have been considered extreme right in this country.
Well, because of the failures of too much government, a lot of the people in the country have decided they want less government. If you look at all the polling, you want more government at a higher cost, more government services at a higher taxes, and I'm not sure that more farm subsidies and more Davis-Bacon qualifies as government services, but we asked the question, do you want more government services, which advantages the pro-government position, and for years and years, American people have moved towards a 2-to-1. No, I want less government and I want lower taxes. And again, what the pledge, that I share with candidates and elected officials says, I won't raise your taxes to the people of the United States. I promise the American people I won't raise your taxes. Not a promise to me, not a promise to Americans tax reform. It's a promise to voters. And therefore, if the country was left of center, they'd say, well, you won't raise taxes. I want my taxes raised. I will go vote for the other guy. And yet I was actually sued by the Democratic Party back in '86. They said, you've endorsed those candidates who took the pledge. How do you get that? I just said that person took the pledge. Everybody knows that's the right answer, said the Democratic Party. I said, really? You might want to tell your congressmen and senators that. But in point of fact, people, if they choose to vote for candidates who, when they see a problem, don't raise taxes, but instead reform government. And that's where I think we can get compromise and agreement with those moderate Democrats, some of the mayors who are tired of beating their heads against the wall, throwing more money at a unionized, bureaucratized education system. In DC, we spend about $27,000 per student K through 12 who graduates, and they don't get $27,000 worth of education taking place. As a matter of fact, they spend about as much per child in DC as the Obamas do at the private school they go to, and it's not working. And some Democrats are willing to look at that and agree to it, but most of them are paralyzed because of the commitments that they've made behind closed doors, not written public commitments like the pledge, to organize labor and the teachers union.
David, I want to push you on one thing if I can. You can respond to Grover also, but I just want to add this in. Katrina made a point earlier that I want to pick up on about asymmetrical polarization. Is it your view that the Democratic Party is as left as the Republican Party is as right, that there's actually been equal movement across, or do you see, as Katrina put it, in asymmetrical dynamic?
I think that she's right that in recent years it's the Republican Party that has moved further in a direction of conservatism than Democrats have moved in the direction of liberalism. But the Democratic Party today is a good deal more liberal than it was 40 years ago, 50 years ago. The Democratic Party movement came earlier. It really came in the 60s, in the 70s, and it moved a lot on some issues. So is there a element now in the Republican Party that I think is way over there? Yeah, I do think there is. And I think that Mitt Romney could lose the election by getting sucked too far over in that direction and making too many pledges. And sort of, in order to satisfy that base, he alienates the people in the middle. If he goes to the middle, he alienates people in the base. And he's got a tough problem to juggle. But I do agree with Grover about there's a lot of there are a lot of interesting people in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party at the local level. There are a lot of people who are much more practical. They're trying to solve problems. There are states where Democrats see that you can't overpromise in terms of public employees. You've got to find some way to deal with that. You're going to have a mayor here from Atlanta. I guess he's coming here, Kasim Reed. He's had to deal with this. He's a Democrat, strong Democrat. But Grover, here's what I want to come back to. It's the tax pledge. I actually don't have any problem at all with you asking people to take a pledge. That it seems to me that's your right as a citizen. You organize, you go out there and work on your beliefs, your convictions. I have a problem with the people who take the pledge. Well, it's just a disagreement. I feel that, it goes back to the old Edmund Burke argument, letter to the electors, about what's the responsibility of someone who is elected to Parliament or into a Democratic body. And Burke had to deal with this question as a conservative. The question of whether you are sent there to carry out and make a promise, in effect, carry that out while you're there in Parliament, or whether, in fact, you're there as an independent to exercise judgment as facts change, and you have to sort of deal with the realities that you're presented with. And Burke came down very strongly. You send us there to exercise our judgment. We're your representatives. That's what a republic is about. It's not pure democracy. It is a republic in which people are expected to exercise their judgment. And if you don't like my judgment, then vote me out of office. And that has worked pretty well. I think now having people make pledges, tie their hands. I was astonished. If you think you're going to solve the debt problem, I was astonished in the debates when the candidates, Republican candidates, were asked if it were you could get $10 of tax cuts for $1 $10 of spending cuts for $1 of tax increases. Would you take that deal? And to a person, they turned that down. It seems to me at some point you've got to say, in my judgment, this is the only way we're going to break out of the deadline.
Katrina,
I mean, the idea that the Democratic Party is more liberal today,
I think it's more liberal than it was 40 or 50 years ago.
do you? I don't think so
but
economically.
pre-60s.
I don't think so. I mean, in terms of the corporatization of the Democratic Party, and that's part of the money factor in our politics.
But if you go back to Franklin Roosevelt's sort of vision of a good society, which he had in his 1944 State of the Union address, that's when he really presented his sense of where the country is. The Democrats in the 60s very largely tried to carry that out. They embraced that, and that was well understood to be a much more liberal version.
But if Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave some of the speeches he gave then, especially the Second Economic Bill of Rights, he'd be run out of Washington as a radical.
I don't think so.
Oh,
I think
a right to a good job, a right to adequate, affordable housing, a right to health care. These are rights that I think
those are still aspirational.
They're aspirational. That's that. But I do think within the Democratic Party, you have different, you might say, going back to the origins of our country, different factions.
Yeah.
And within the Republican Party, I think that has changed fundamentally. Occasionally, you'll see an Olympia Snowe or a Collins, but for the most part, even though there's no, the compromise is gone and there's no voting for, quote, bipartisan process. I would just come back to, you spoke about public employees. Why not also talk about the tax breaks corporations are getting in the state?
We should. We should.
But
Absolutely.
The fact that public employees, especially teachers, have become the targets, and the view is that you take them on and it's a silver bullet for the problems we face, is wrong. And in Wisconsin, which is where we saw the first real, it seems to me, movement politics of this period, where you had 150,000 people at a certain point occupying the state capital. It was teachers, it was librarians, it was nurses, it was the women, by the way, Mitt Romney keeps calling out on, because women are mostly the public employees whose jobs have been savaged by the cuts in Republican-led state houses and states. But I just think there needs to be a broader collective sense of this country where there are different elements working together. I see Andy Stern here. Andy Stern, I think, has thought in very creative ways about how you take a labor movement, you modernize it, also how you use capital effectively, which is a passion of mine. Why should we be using private equity funds to just speculate? Why not invest them in this country? Final point, the Republicans in the Chamber of Commerce agreed months ago, it seems to me, to an infrastructure bank, that we could have a bank that would invest in the rebuilding, physical rebuilding of this country, and then they walked away from it. So at a time when we face Gilded Age inequality, I just don't get the starving of revenues and investment that is so desperately
If you're confusing the Chamber of Commerce with the modern Republican Party, you're not seeing what moves
the
in
Chamber
DC.
of Commerce, what's interesting to me is that
they say lots of
there are
things.
many
We have to
chambers
fight
around
them.
this country that have left the Chamber of Commerce because they see the Chamber as representing big corporations and not the small businesses, which have been at the core of America's strength.
Grover, I'm going to let you respond to that, but I want to add something in that Katrina just said. Are you at all concerned that, like when you hear Katrina say something about inequality, does that concern you at all? Is that on your radar? Is that something you think about as an issue?
Well, the central issue in politics is liberty. I mean, we should set up conditions where people are free to lead their lives, raise their families, and improve their situation as they see fit. I'm not interested in the government coming in with guns and telling people how to run their lives, and I'm concerned that those who advocate more state power and more state control over people's lives, step one is they're constantly trying to come up with shortages so they can ration them. And they're very unhappy about the new fracking and natural gas. So there's now no longer a shortage in energy, and therefore we're not going to be able to ration it. We can't have cap and trade. And all of this stuff is collapsed, this effort to cartelize the economy and control it. The interesting thing about inequality is it's one thing to say we're against poverty, we'd like to have more people have jobs and so on. Well, I would argue that if you get the government out of the way of passing Davis-Bacon laws, which were explicitly passed to keep African Americans out of unionized work in government construction. And on the floor of the House and Senate, everyone said that's what they were doing. And when I went to go talk to a Republican chairman of the relevant committee who was arguing against my opposition to his raising the gas tax, I said, well, if you want more money for roads, why don't you get rid of Davis-Bacon, which raises the cost of building a road 25 or 33%. And his answer was, what, do you want all the roads built by Hispanics? So it's good to see that the Davis-Bacon Act remains a racist law as it was originally passed. It's just shifted its target. I don't consider much of what the government does helpful to low-income people. I don't consider the DC education system helping the kids in DC. They're not doing education. They're spending a lot of money, and a lot of unionized, the unions are making a lot of money off it, but education is not what's happening in the DC system. So don't tell me the government's helping these people. They're clearly not. And so I would argue step one is get the government out of doing those things that are destructive. Farm subsidies, cartelizing the agriculture industry, telling people what they can and can't grow. This is not helpful.
Do you see a role for government in any aspect of American life?
Sure, I think we need an army big enough to keep the Canadians on their side of the border. I'm not sure that, I'm not in favor of running an empire and occupying other countries for protracted periods of time. I think that it's a good idea to put murderers in prison and make sure that people maintain their, can have a court system that you can go to for various cases. So,
let's come back to the central question. That is, how do we break out of the gridlock? How do you see this unfolding?
Well, I mean, we're talking about the conflicts, but in point of fact, in D.C., I mean, I get a kick out of people going, oh, you're a terribly partisan guy. I work a great deal of my time with folks on the left, and first started talking with Christopher Hitchens back before he became a right-winger, when he was writing for you guys, and because he wrote a piece on civil liberties, and he said, those of us on the left need to talk to the libertarians about civil liberties because we're going to have troubles here. So I called him on the phone and started talking to him. And there's a great deal. We run a meeting in D.C. in a room about this big, 150 center-right activists each week get together and people talk about what they're doing. Midway through the Clinton administration, the ACLU started to show up because of all the power grabs that the Clinton administration had on civil liberties issues. And the first time there was a sort of tee-hee-hee, isn't that interesting, the ACLU is here. And about the third time they showed up, people said, what are they doing now? So there's a great deal of left-right conversation, both on questions of what's an appropriate foreign policy, on civil liberties issue. The only way we're going to get a decent immigration reform package will be a left-right. I work with Democratic senators and congressmen on thinking through that sort of thing. So there's a lot of places we can work together to reform government on behalf of liberty. And whenever the Ds are willing to be in favor of liberty, I want to work with them.
Everyone is now pointing toward what's going to come after the elections in a lame duck session and the first few months of the next administration on questions of taxes and spending and deficits and a debt ceiling and sequesters, this so-called taxageddon. How do you see that unfolding? Is there a way to get solutions and get beyond the paralysis?
Sure. And the second handout that they have not handed out, but they will have outside the door, is an article that I wrote, The Road to 60. But the key thing here to put on your refrigerator is the list of all of the Senate seats up in 2012, this November, and then 2014. So how do we get to reform? The Republicans will hold the House for the next decade, thanks to redistricting, and great candidates.
Thanks to redistricting.
And on the Senate side, again, who did the redistricting? State legislators did the redistricting, not just for themselves, but for Congress. Put this on the other part of your refrigerator. But there are, this November, 23 Democratic Senate seats up and 10 Republican seats. Of the Democratic seats, about half are vulnerable. They're in traditionally our states, and many of them were elected during the Democrat wave election in '06. Of the 10 Republicans up, I worry about 2. Scott Brown in Massachusetts, who's polling ahead, doing fine, will probably win, but it is Massachusetts. I grew up there before emigrating to the United States. And Maine, which would have been a Republican seat for sure, but Olympia Snow's not running. They got 4 fine candidates, but they have to beat each other up first before they decide which one runs. So I worry about 2 of the 10. Ds have to worry about half of the 23. So the Republicans will net the 4 they need to get a functioning majority in the Senate in 12. It's 14 that's interesting, which solves all your problems about conflict. And that is that there are 20 Ds up and again, half of them in Republican states, including guys like Alaska and North Carolina and other places where they have to import them. And on the Republican side, 13 Republicans, all of whom are safe in their states. Because remember, if you got elected in 06 or 08 as a Republican, you are in a very Republican state, or you have real talents that allowed you to survive that effort. Some of us in the Republican side couldn't understand what Bush and Karl Rove and George Bush were thinking when they gave away all those Senate seats in 06 and 08. It seemed foolish at the time. But we now see that they were cleverly planning to sneak up behind the Democrats in 12 and 14 and take them all back again. So what we'll have is a Republican Senate for the rest of the decade and maybe a supermajority here. Remember, if you just look at those states that Bush carried in 2000 and 2004, when he limped across the finish line, sort of almost, right, in two elections, he carried 30 and 32 states. So the Senate was redistricted a long time ago to advantage the Republicans.
So that then says, with your own scenario, that says after 2014, starting in 2015, you'd have a Senate, you think a large enough Senate bloc for Republicans to govern, you could solve these problems. But that means between now and 2015?
Oh, no, in 2013, if Romney gets elected, you can pass something very similar to the Ryan
bill.
plan.
You can in
sure.
the Senate with the United States, with the Senate, with the Democrats holding 56, 57, 58 seats,
yeah,
even at your best scenario.
You do it inside reconciliation. You can get much of it done. Yeah.
But Katrina, I just
don't worry. With this problem will solve itself. You'll like it in a free country. It's gonna be great.
Go ahead, please.
The misuse of the term freedom. How,
guys in the government not pointing guns at you.
No, I mean,
that's step one.
When are guys in the government
pointing guns?
Telling you to do things.
When?
When? Every law, at the end of the day, has a gun behind it, or you'd ignore it. If you don't pay your taxes, they don't knock on the door at some point? There's no state power? How do you think it holds together?
The visceral hatred and demonization of government, which at the end of the day is us in many ways, I know is us, is so destructive because it leads to the inability, I believe, to have a kind of collective thinking about where this country heads. But it also leads to raw facts, such as the median wage for male workers is the same as it was in 1969. And or the fact that economists, many, maybe not, would tell you that in a recession, in the absence of private spending and low demand, government must play a role in that period. When we come out of a recession, then government spending goes back to a different point. There is a role for the private market as well. But just one fact, what stunned me last week was in the budget cuts, cutting job training at the same time as you're cutting social programs leads to a Mad Max at best kind of country. So I don't get the rationale. I also would take issue, someone said earlier about how the Democrats controlled the Senate. And David's the historian on this. I don't believe we saw such an abuse and misuse of the filibuster in 1 or 2 years, 2008, 2009, as we saw the overuse of the filibuster was used more in those years, 2008, 2009, than in the 50s and 60s combined. So there's a gaming of the system by those who did not want President Obama to be able to govern.
Okay.
And not to personalize it, because I have real issues with the Democratic Party. But you are looking at a Ryan budget that, as I said earlier, will be your fantasy, which is to gut all these programs. One last point. On the healthcare
programs that don't work.
On the healthcare front, we didn't bring that up. I think it will be very important what happens with the Supreme Court and the Affordable Health Care Act. You may see the mandate ruled unconstitutional, but other pieces severed from that. You may see chaos in the states or states finding ways to go forward. But overall, it's the case of a rollback.
I'm sorry, we have to cut it short. This is very interesting. I have like 20 questions I didn't get to, but I have to be fair to the audience and open it up for questions. And we have a mic over here, do we? And we have a mic over there. So if you would, why don't we start here, right up front, I guess.
My name is Rob Werner. I work for Americans for Campaign Reform. And I would like you to address the role of money in politics to our dysfunction, and I think our dependence of Congress, both sides of the aisle, doesn't matter, on our political funding situation. Incidentally, here in New York, there is an opportunity to pass public funding here on the state level, which I think would be enormously important to the national conversation. Please comment.
That's my next Washington Post column to move. No, but New York City, as many of you know, has perhaps the best functioning matching small contributions 1 to 6 system. It has not been ruled unconstitutional, as I believe the court has done with clean money in Arizona and Vermont. But to me, that is one of the fundamental questions of our time. How do we get money out of our politics? Because until we do, we are going to see the concentrations of wealth and power in ways that are perilous for the future of our democracy. So I think the president has come out, even while he is super PACing it up, come out for the constitutional amendment strategy to overturn Citizens United, which rolled back 100 years of jurisprudence. That is very tough, as anyone in this room knows, an amendment strategy. But you could, and you do have, and this is where the Republicans are mostly AWOL, though there is some transpartisan work on money in politics, have come out for clean money legislation in the House and Senate, for disclose, for various things. The other problem is the court. Until we basically are at risk of having a 1% court if Mitt Romney is elected, and a court that may now burrow deep into unraveling the last scaffolding of campaign finance reform, which is not just a good government process issue. It is fundamental, it seems to me, to equality, the ability to have freedom and liberty, and the ability of people to feel like participants and not simply spectators at some democracy.
Well, this is a real difference of opinion. I mean, the central question that I think you ought to ask is the money even contributed voluntarily, or is it stolen from people? What happened in Wisconsin, if you're a teacher making $50,000 a year, the teachers union had a contract where they got $1,000 of your money, and the government would take your money and hand it to the teachers union. You never even saw it. It was withheld from your paycheck. And one of the reforms in Wisconsin that they passed was the government, the city, the county, the school district, the state, will not be taking union dues from you and giving them to the union. If the union wants to raise money from you, they can come and take it themselves. And what they're finding is people aren't willing to give the unions as much money as the unions were able to take non-voluntarily each time. And of course, the whole argument that you have about whether contributions are voluntary or not, Jefferson's comment about how awful it is to take somebody's resources and use them to propagate ideas that they're hostile to. I would argue step one is take compulsory dues, money that's taken from people by force and without their personal say-so, and using it for politics is step one. And that is something that's being moved. They just voted this for teachers in Michigan. So that reform is working its way through. And of course, organized labor's contributions dwarf the other major PACs that exist.
That's not
corporate.
true.
They
That's
do.
not
The
true.
top 20.
That's not true.
Okay.
That's just not true.
You can look it up. We don't have to argue about it. But make a list of the top 20 PACs.
Ideally, all our questions would be about as short as this one is. We have, it looks like I got a clock right in front of me counting down. So we have about 9 minutes. If we can keep our questions short and our answers short, I'd appreciate it. Right here, please.
I was actually born in a country that was very efficient, in Yugoslavia. It did things without much discussion. My question is, would Madison and the founding fathers be pleased with the way the government is working today?
Would Madison be pleased, the founding fathers and Madison be
Would
pleased
Madison be pleased?
in the way the government is working?
Are you kidding? No. Be appalled.
Though they did like partisanship, didn't? I mean, that was embedded.
Absolutely, but the notion was that you would have clashes that would not
Principle
lead you
and
to a
ideas.
lower common denominator, they would lead you to a higher place. And this is a very, very different day.
well,
Winston Lord. David, you said you were very pessimistic about the gridlock being broken after the elections, but later you mentioned these impending fiscal deadlines, taxes, sequesters, debt limits, and so on. Is it possible that these deadlines will actually force people to make deals, and doesn't Obama have some leverage with the expiration of the tax cuts?
Well, Winston, it's good to see you again. I think both sides are being pretty unrealistic at this point about what they're going to work out. On the Democratic side, I talk to people and they say, well, we'll win the election. Grover thinks they'll win the election. Democrats say, we'll win the election. The people will have spoken clearly, and that will give us the leverage to go against the Republicans. And we're going to propose some solutions after the elections are over, and we're going to not negotiate very much, but we're going to take them to the brink, and they're going to cave. The Republicans will cave at that point. I asked, have you talked to many Republicans recently? And my second question is, what's Plan B? Because I don't see that happening.
We went through this last year after the last election. The Democrats extended all the tax cuts and invented a couple of their own. And then in 2011, they agreed to drop $2.5 trillion in spending. So, I mean, people keep talking about the failure of the budget process, failure to raise taxes. I mean, if you wanted the government to raise taxes, you failed. But if you wanted the government to spend less, the American people won. And that's what the election was about, and that's where Congress is. And so I was reasonably happy with $2.5 trillion in less spending over the next decade. It was, again, a compromise. We wanted $6 trillion in spending reduction. We wanted to reform government through some pieces of the Ryan bill. And look, we're going to disagree. We're going to have an election. We're going to decide. You want bigger government or less government?
my concern is that you would also see a dagger struck at the heart of an already fragile recovery in the way it may play out. And Europe, Grover joked about Greece, but I do think the one restraint on Mitt Romney is he's going to look at the UK and see how austerity has failed. And that, I think, may... but the recovery is very fragile.
One second. I just finished a book on the recovery called Debacle, about how well it's going. This is about the weakest recovery we've ever had in American history. Compare it to Canada, compare it to other countries that didn't go on a spending spree. Everything that was done actually led to make things worse. We have had people, since the recovery started, I'm not talking about when the recession happened or when Obama was trying to fix it. When the recovery started, we have had very little GDP growth, very few net job creation, and people are leaving the job force, the workforce. People are not looking for jobs. So one of the reasons the unemployment level has been dropping is not because they're cheating at the Department of Labor. It's that the number of people looking for work is falling, which is what you expect during a recession, happens during all recessions. But the opposite of that, 2% of the population came into the workforce during Reagan's recovery. About 2% of the population's workforce has left the workforce since the recovery started. This is very bad recovery. Everything that was done moved us in the wrong direction, and those countries that did the opposite are doing better.
I didn't have a chance to finish my thought with Winston. Listen, here's the issue. Both sides now believe the people will speak in November, will have a clear sense of what the country wants, and then the legislation will follow. I think the possibilities are really high, the likelihood is really high the country will not speak with a clear voice. There's the chances of Mitt Romney winning the election right now is less than 50%. The chances of Republicans keeping the House is more than 50%. Right. If that's the outcome, it's not a clear voice. At that point, somebody has to step up and be statesman and have the guts to do the right thing and get some things done. No, I don't. I think the likelihood is they're going to kick it can down.
We got time for one more. How about right here up front? This will be our last question.
Sure.
To each of you, but perhaps starting with Mr. Norquist, do you have a sense of the common good when it comes to the nation, and is that a possible unifying point? Thank you.
The question was, do you have a sense of the common good for the nation, and is that a possible unifying point for those who didn't hear?
Sure. I mean, the Constitution and ordered liberty. I mean, the whole point of the Constitution is a list of things the government's not allowed to do. Okay? Don't tell people what church to go to. Don't tell people where they can keep and bear arms. A whole series of things the government's not allowed to do, and a smaller list of things that they're allowed to do, which they've run amok on. So, yeah, I think the Constitution is a very good model for limited government and for stopping people who run the government from too much running over our lives. I think that the government needs to be smaller and more constrained. But yeah, the common good is people should be free to run their lives as they see fit. They can go to any church, synagogue, or mosque they want to. They can run their lives as they want to. They can raise their children as they want to. They can create jobs and opportunities as they wish to. That's the common good. No king tells us what religion we should be or what other thing we should do. Screw that. That's some other country.
Katrina and David, really quickly.
Sometimes I think that it is the case that, quote, elites are more polarized than what's actually going on in communities around this country. I think the media, for the most part, with the exception of places like The Nation, is not playing a helpful role in creating a sense of common good because, and we're complicit. We're complicit. Well, we're complicit in that sometimes because these cable shows are devised to pit people against each other as opposed to an intelligent conversation, which I think this country would benefit from. And I go back again to the economics. At a moment when in 2010, 93% of the income growth in this country went to the top 1%. It is not all, but it is very, very important to understand that it is hard to build a common good until there is a sense of shared prosperity.
David, did you have a quick response?
I just think what we see here is one of the reasons we have polarization is there are deeply conflicted views of what this country ought to be. What would be the common good?
Thank you, and everyone for coming.